Sarah stood outside Professor Chen's office door for several minutes, gathering courage for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. Through the frosted glass, she could see his silhouette moving around the cramped space, organizing papers with the same meticulous attention he brought to his lectures. She knocked softly and heard his crisp "come in" from within. David looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression neutral but watchful. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, noting again her careful way of sitting that suggested some physical limitation. "Thank you for coming, Miss Martinez," David began, settling back in his chair with the confidence of someone accustomed to holding authority. "I wanted to discuss your attendance issues and what appears to be a pattern of making excuses for academic obligations." Sarah felt her chest tighten, but kept her voice steady. "Professor Chun, I've only been late to class once this semester, and I submitted my assignment early despite the circumstances." "The circumstances," David repeated with skeptical emphasis. "Yes, let's talk about these mysterious medical appointments that seem so conveniently timed. In my 15 years of teaching, I've noticed that students often develop sudden health concerns when academic pressure mounts." The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah realized that this meeting was not about guidance or support, but about judgment and intimidation. Professor Chun had already decided she was lying, and nothing she said would change his mind without concrete proof he would not dismiss. "I understand your skepticism," Sarah said carefully. "Perhaps I could provide documentation from my healthcare providers to verify my appointments." David waved dismissively. "Documentation can be fabricated or exaggerated. What concerns me more is your attitude toward responsibility. Graduate school requires unwavering commitment, not creative excuse-making when life becomes challenging." Sarah felt anger building beneath her careful composure. This man knew nothing about her sacrifices or commitment, yet he presumed to lecture her about responsibility. She had given more to her country than he could imagine, and now he questioned her dedication to education. "Professor, I take my academic obligations very seriously," she replied, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "I've never missed an assignment deadline, and my work consistently meets or exceeds requirements. One late arrival shouldn't overshadow my overall performance. Performance is about more than grades, Miss Martinez. It's about character, integrity, and respect for institutional standards. When you stroll into my classroom 20 minutes late with a flimsy medical excuse, you demonstrate contempt for these values." The word contempt stung particularly deeply. Sarah had spent her adult life serving institutions larger than herself, sacrificing personal comfort for collective good. To be accused of contempt by someone who had never tested his commitment beyond academic walls felt like betrayal of everything she represented. "I have never shown contempt for this program or institution," Sarah said, her military bearing becoming more pronounced despite her efforts to remain casual. "My service record speaks to my character and integrity in ways that classroom attendance cannot measure." David noticed the shift in her posture and tone but interpreted it as defensive aggression rather than wounded pride. Military service is admirable, but it doesn't provide blanket immunity from academic standards. Many veterans successfully transition to civilian education without expecting special treatment. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Sarah protested, feeling the conversation spiraling beyond her control. "I'm asking for basic understanding when medical realities occasionally conflict with scheduling preferences." "Medical realities," David scoffed. "Every student claims mysterious medical issues these days. Depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, chronic pain. The list of convenient diagnoses grows longer each year. Whatever happened to personal responsibility and toughening up?" Sarah stared at him in stunned silence. The casual dismissal of legitimate medical conditions revealed a callousness that shocked even her low expectations. This man taught trauma psychology while displaying complete ignorance about trauma's lasting effects. "Professor Chun," she began slowly, "what if I told you that my medical appointments are for ongoing treatment related to injuries sustained during combat deployment? Would that change your perspective?" David's expression remained unmoved. Military injuries are often overplayed for sympathy or benefits. Unless you're missing limbs or confined to a wheelchair, I fail to see how past injuries excuse present irresponsibility. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had heard ignorant comments about invisible disabilities before, but never from someone supposedly educated about psychological trauma. The man teaching her about post-traumatic growth was demonstrating spectacular insensitivity to its reality. Sarah stood abruptly, her leg protesting the sudden movement, but her dignity demanding action. She reached for the hem of her jeans and rolled up the left leg, revealing the extensive scarring that covered her shin and calf. The tissue was discolored and twisted, marking where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. "This is what an IED does to a human leg," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned authority. "The explosion killed 2 of my fellow soldiers instantly. I spent 8 months learning to walk again, and still attend physical therapy twice weekly to maintain what mobility I've regained." David's face went pale as he stared at the revealed scarring. The wounds were clearly severe and permanent, the kind of damage that would cause lifelong pain and limitation. His confident dismissal of her medical needs suddenly seemed grotesquely inappropriate. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as years of suppressed frustration poured forth. "The morning I was late to your class, I spent 3 hours managing a PTSD flashback triggered by thunderstorms that sounded like incoming artillery. I debated skipping class entirely, but dragged myself here because education means everything to me." She rolled her jeans back down and remained standing, looking down at her professor with newfound authority. "I didn't mention my military service or injuries because I wanted to succeed on merit alone. I've worked twice as hard as my classmates to prove I belong here, only to have my dedication questioned by someone who mistakes privilege for strength." David struggled to find words, his usual confidence shattered by the brutal reality of his student's experience. The scarring alone indicated trauma beyond his academic understanding, but the composed way she handled his ignorance revealed strength he had failed to recognize. "Miss Martinez, I had no idea about the extent of your injuries," he stammered. "Your file mentioned military service, but the details weren't specified." "Because I chose not to specify them," Sarah replied firmly. "I wanted to be judged as a student, not as a victim or inspiration." But, apparently, maintaining privacy about personal trauma is interpreted as dishonesty in your classroom. The role reversal was complete. Sarah now stood in position of moral authority while Professor Chun grappled with the magnitude of his misjudgment. His academic expertise in trauma psychology felt hollow compared to her lived experience of survival and recovery. "I owe you an apology," David said finally, his voice subdued with genuine remorse. "My comments were inappropriate and based on assumptions that were completely wrong. You're right that I mistook privilege for strength." Sarah studied his face, searching for sincerity behind the words. Years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious about accepting apologies from authority figures who had shown their true character under pressure. "Professor Chun, your apology addresses the immediate offense, but not the underlying problem," she said thoughtfully. "You teach trauma psychology while dismissing trauma's reality when it doesn't meet your expectations. How many other students have you misjudged because their struggles weren't visible enough for your recognition?" The question struck at the heart of David's professional identity. He prided himself on understanding human psychology, yet he had completely failed to recognize genuine trauma symptoms in his own classroom. His expertise was theoretical, while hers was visceral and earned through suffering. "You're absolutely right," David admitted, his academic arrogance finally giving way to humility. "I've been teaching about trauma from a position of clinical distance that blinded me to its reality in my students' lives. Your courage in sharing your experience has opened my eyes to my own limitations." Sarah softened slightly at his apparent sincerity, but remained guarded. "Understanding limitations is the beginning of wisdom, Professor. But knowledge without compassion is just academic vanity." The observation hung between them as David confronted the gap between his theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. Sarah had taught him more about trauma psychology in 10 minutes than he had learned in years of clinical study. "Would you be willing to help me become a better teacher?" David asked quietly, "Not by sharing personal details publicly, but by helping me understand how to create a more supportive environment for students dealing with invisible challenges." Sarah considered the request carefully. Working with Professor Chun meant risking further vulnerability, but it also offered the chance to improve conditions for future students who might struggle with similar issues. "I'm willing to have that conversation," she said finally, "but only if you commit to examining your assumptions about student motivation and capability. Too many people suffer in silence because authority figures mistake trauma responses for character flaws." "You have my commitment," David replied solemnly. "And you have my word that your tardiness will not be held against you in any way. In fact, I'd like to learn about reasonable accommodations that might help you and other students succeed." Sarah nodded, feeling a cautious hope that something positive might emerge from this painful confrontation. She had not expected to educate her professor about disability and trauma, but perhaps her experience could spare others similar judgment. As she prepared to leave, David stopped her with another question. "Miss Martinez, may I ask what drew you to psychology after your military service?" Sarah paused at the door, considering how much to reveal. "I realized that healing from trauma requires understanding its effects on mind and body. I want to help other veterans navigate the civilian world without losing themselves in the process." "Your perspective will make you an exceptional psychologist," David said with newfound respect. "I'm sorry I couldn't see that sooner." Walking across campus afterward, Sarah felt lighter despite the emotional exhaustion of the encounter. Standing up to Professor Chun had been terrifying, but ultimately empowering. She had refused to let his ignorance define her worth or derail her goals. Marcus was waiting by her usual library table, concern evident in his expression. "How did the meeting go? You look like you've been through a battle." Sarah smiled at his unintentionally accurate assessment. "Actually, I think I won this one. It was messy and painful, but necessary. Want to talk about it?" For the first time since arriving at graduate school, Sarah felt ready to share her story with a trusted friend. Professor Chin's apology had validated her experience and courage, making it easier to trust others with her truth. "Yes," she said, settling into her chair with careful grace. "But it's a long story, and some parts are difficult to hear." "I've got time," Marcus replied simply. "And I'm stronger than I look." As Sarah began to share her journey from combat zones to classrooms, she realized that Professor Chin's cruel assumption had inadvertently led to an important breakthrough. By forcing her to defend her experiences, he had helped her find her voice and claim her rightful place in academic spaces. The hidden battle wound would always be part of her story, but it no longer had to be a source of shame or limitation. Instead, it could become a bridge to understanding and healing, both for herself and for others who carried invisible scars from their own battles. Professor Chin would need time to process what he had learned and change his approach to teaching. Sarah would continue her studies with renewed confidence in her ability to succeed despite others' misconceptions. And, perhaps, together, they could help create an environment where all students' struggles were met with understanding rather than suspicion. The laughter had died, replaced by respect hard-earned through revelation and courage. Sarah's hidden battle wound had finally found its voice point. 3 weeks into the semester, Sarah had established a careful routine. She arrived early to secure seats that provided clear sight lines and easy exits, completed assignments well ahead of deadlines, and participated just enough to demonstrate engagement without drawing excessive attention. Her strategy was working until the morning everything changed. The previous evening had been particularly difficult. A thunderstorm had rolled through the city, bringing with it the kind of sudden, explosive sounds that transported Sarah instantly back to combat zones. She had spent hours awake, fighting flashback episodes, and managing the anxiety that followed. By morning, her carefully maintained composure was hanging by a thread. Professor Chin noticed Sarah's absence immediately when class began. In 3 weeks, she had never missed a session or arrived late. Her empty seat in the back corner felt conspicuous, raising questions about her commitment that he found surprisingly disappointing. He had begun to appreciate her thoughtful contributions and rigorous preparation. 20 minutes into the lecture, the classroom door opened quietly. Sarah slipped in, moving more stiffly than usual, her face pale with exhaustion and barely controlled distress. She had debated skipping class entirely, but refused to let her invisible wounds derail her academic goals. David paused mid-sentence as she settled into her seat with obvious discomfort. The interruption annoyed him, particularly since punctuality was a fundamental expectation he had clearly outlined. Sarah's tardiness felt like disrespect for his time and the other students' learning. "Miss Martinez," David said, his voice carrying a tone of cold disapproval. "How kind of you to join us. Perhaps you could share what urgent matter prevented you from arriving on time." The classroom fell silent as all attention focused on Sarah. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar sensation of being singled out and judged. Her mind raced through possible responses, all of them inadequate to explain the complex reality of her situation. "I apologize for the disruption," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil. "I had a medical appointment that ran longer than expected." David's expression hardened with skepticism. The excuse sounded convenient and rehearsed, exactly the kind of fabrication he had grown tired of hearing from students seeking to avoid responsibility. Medical appointments could be scheduled outside of class time with proper planning. "A medical appointment," David repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. How unfortunate that such appointments always seem to coincide with class obligations. "Perhaps next time you could schedule your health care around your academic commitments." Several students shifted uncomfortably as Professor Chen's sarcasm filled the room. Sarah sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their slight trembling. The public humiliation felt familiar yet devastating, reminiscent of military dressing downs, but somehow more personal and cruel. Marcus Thompson shot Sarah a sympathetic look, recognizing the unfairness of the professor's response. Other students avoided eye contact, grateful not to be in Sarah's position while silently judging her apparent irresponsibility. Furthermore, David continued, warming to his theme, "I find it curious that students often develop sudden medical needs when assignments are due. Your paper on post-traumatic growth was due today, wasn't it?" "It was submitted electronically at 6 this morning," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She had worked through the night to complete the assignment despite her deteriorating mental state, determined not to use her struggles as an excuse for academic failure. David checked his email quickly on his phone and confirmed the submission timestamp. The early completion surprised him, but did not diminish his irritation with her tardiness. Standards were standards, regardless of personal circumstances. "Lucky for you that technology allows such convenient submission timing," David said dismissively. "Now, if we may continue without further interruptions, we were discussing the relationship between trauma severity and recovery outcomes." The irony of the lecture topic was not lost on Sarah as she struggled to take notes with shaking hands. David launched into a detailed analysis of how individuals respond differently to traumatic events, completely unaware that he was describing his students' daily reality with clinical detachment. As the class progressed, Sarah fought to maintain focus while managing the physiological effects of her morning flashback episode. Her leg throbbed with phantom pain that often accompanied psychological distress, and she had to concentrate on breathing steadily to avoid another anxiety spike. David noticed her obvious discomfort, but interpreted it as embarrassment over being caught in what he assumed was a lie. Her pale complexion and rigid posture reinforced his belief that she was a typical student trying to manipulate her way out of consequences. The literature suggests that individuals with stronger pre-trauma psychological foundations demonstrate greater resilience, David explained to the class. However, some people seem predisposed to using adversity as an excuse rather than an opportunity for growth. Sarah flinched at the indirect reference, knowing it was aimed at her despite being couched in academic language. The accusation of weakness stung particularly because it contradicted everything she had fought to overcome. She had rebuilt her life through sheer determination, not by making excuses. During the break, several classmates approached Sarah with quiet words of support. They recognized Professor Chen's response as unnecessarily harsh, even if they did not understand the full context of the situation. Their kindness helped counteract some of the shame and anger building inside her. Marcus lingered as others left for coffee. "That was completely out of line," he said quietly. "Don't let him get to you. Everyone knows you're one of the hardest workers in the program." "Thanks," Sarah managed, grateful for his support, but too drained to elaborate. She appreciated his attempt to comfort her, while wishing she could explain why the professor's words had hit so deeply. When class resumed, David continued his lecture on trauma psychology with apparent obliviousness to the real trauma he had just inflicted on his student. He discussed the importance of therapeutic environments and supportive relationships in recovery, never connecting his own behavior to the principles he taught. Sarah endured the remainder of class in a state of emotional numbness, a protective mechanism she had developed during her most difficult recovery periods. She took mechanical notes and avoided eye contact, counting minutes until she could escape to process what had happened. As students filed out at the end of class, David called after Sarah. "Miss Martinez, please see me during office hours this week. We need to discuss your attendance expectations and commitment to this program." The words felt like a threat wrapped in academic authority. Sarah nodded without speaking and left quickly, her leg dragging more noticeably as stress amplified her physical limitations. She needed solitude to decompress before the situation escalated further. In the hallway, Marcus caught up with her again. "Sarah, are you okay? You look like you're about to collapse." She paused, considering how much to reveal. Marcus had shown genuine concern, and she desperately needed an ally in this hostile environment. But trust came hard after years of disappointment and misunderstanding. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, that's not true. But I can't really explain right now." "You don't owe anyone explanations," Marcus replied firmly. "Especially not Chun. Half the faculty think he's brilliant, and the other half think he's an arrogant bully. Guess which side I'm on." Sarah managed a weak smile, the first genuine expression she had shown all day. "Thanks for saying that. I was starting to think I was being too sensitive." "You're not," Marcus assured her. "What he did in there was unprofessional and cruel. If you want to report it, I'll back you up as a witness." The suggestion terrified Sarah more than Professor Chin's hostility. Filing complaints meant scrutiny, interviews, and detailed explanations she was not prepared to provide. Her military background had taught her to handle conflicts directly rather than through official channels. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll handle it myself," Sarah decided. "Maybe the office hours meeting will go better." Marcus looked skeptical but respected her choice. "Just remember, you don't have to face everything alone. Some battles are worth fighting with allies." His words stayed with Sarah as she made her way to the library, her usual refuge during emotional storms. She found her customary corner table and spread out her materials, but concentration proved impossible. Professor Chin's accusations replayed in her mind, mixing with older voices that had questioned her strength and commitment. The irony was overwhelming. She was studying trauma psychology while being traumatized by her professor's ignorant assumptions. The man teaching others about healing was actively wounding one of his students through his prejudice and arrogance. Sarah opened her laptop and pulled up the assignment she had submitted that morning. 15 pages analyzing post-traumatic growth in combat veterans, written with scholarly objectivity while drawing on her own devastating experiences. She had poured her heart into the research while maintaining academic distance from her personal connection to the material. Reading through her own analysis, Sarah found validation for her journey that Professor Chin's words could not diminish. The research clearly showed that recovery was possible, but never simple, that growth could emerge from trauma, but only through tremendous effort and support. She embodied the very phenomena she had studied. Her phone buzzed with a reminder about tomorrow's physical therapy appointment. The twice-weekly sessions were essential for maintaining the mobility she had regained through months of painful rehabilitation. She had scheduled them strategically to avoid class conflicts, but sometimes the timing was unavoidable. Sarah realized that Professor Chun would never understand the careful coordination required to manage her complex medical needs while pursuing academic goals. His privileged position allowed him to assume that everyone operated from the same baseline of health and stability. As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah worked through her anger and hurt by focusing on upcoming assignments. Excellence was her best defense against accusations of weakness or manipulation. She would prove her worth through undeniable competence, regardless of her professor's narrow-minded assumptions. The library grew quiet as other students departed for dinner and evening activities. Sarah remained at her table, finding peace in solitude and purposeful work. She had learned to transform pain into productivity, a skill that served her well in academic environments that could not accommodate her differences. Her phone rang softly, displaying her sister Maria's contact information. Sarah hesitated before answering, not sure she could maintain her usual cheerful facade after the day's events. "Hey, how's grad school treating you?" Maria asked with typical sisterly warmth. "It's challenging," Sarah replied carefully, "but I'm managing." "You sound tired. Are you taking care of yourself? Getting enough rest?" The simple question almost broke Sarah's carefully maintained composure. Her sister's concern highlighted how isolated she felt in her current environment, where showing vulnerability was interpreted as weakness rather than humanity. "Some days are harder than others," Sarah admitted. "Today was particularly difficult. Want to talk about it?" Sarah considered sharing the morning's humiliation, but decided against burdening her sister with problems she could not solve. Maria had supported her through the worst of her recovery and deserved to see her succeeding, not struggling. "Just typical academic stress," Sarah deflected. "I'll get through it." "You always do," Maria said proudly. "But remember, it's okay to ask for help when you need it. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." After the call ended, Sarah sat in the quiet library pondering her sister's words. She had spent years proving herself in various contexts, first as a soldier, then as a survivor, and now as a student. The constant need to demonstrate worthiness was exhausting, but felt necessary for survival. Tomorrow she would face Professor Chen's office hours meeting and whatever additional judgment he planned to deliver. She would go prepared with documentation of her academic performance and commitment to the program. But, more importantly, she would go with the knowledge that his opinion, however painful, could not define her worth or derail her goals. The battle wound hidden beneath her jeans throbbed as she packed her materials to leave. It was a daily reminder of the price she had paid for serving her country and the strength she had found in surviving the unsurvivable. Professor Chen might laugh at her excuses, but he could never understand the courage required simply to show up each day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the university campus as Sarah Martinez limped toward the psychology building. Her left leg dragged slightly with each step, a barely noticeable hitch in her gait that she had learned to mask over the years. At 26, she carried herself with quiet determination, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her backpack slung carefully over one shoulder. Professor David Chun watched from his office window as students filed into the courtyard below. His eyes settled on Sarah, noting her unusual walking pattern. As the head of the graduate psychology program, he prided himself on reading people quickly. In his mind, he had already categorized her as another student looking for easy accommodations. The semester had just begun, and David had already received 3 requests for extended deadlines and modified assignments. Each student claimed various personal challenges, and his patience was wearing thin. Excellence demanded discipline, he believed, not excuses. Sarah entered the seminar room 15 minutes early, choosing a seat near the back corner. She arranged her materials carefully, pulling out a worn notebook and a digital recorder. Her movements were deliberate and practiced, each action serving a specific purpose that others could not understand. As other students filtered in, Sarah observed their easy confidence, their casual interactions. Most were fresh out of undergraduate programs, eager and unaware of life's harder lessons. She envied their lightness, remembering when she too had moved through the world without calculating every step. Marcus Thompson dropped into the seat beside her, flashing a friendly smile. A former college athlete turned psychology student, he radiated the kind of physical confidence that Sarah once possessed. His presence reminded her of everything she had lost, yet she appreciated his genuine warmth. "First day nerves?" Marcus asked, noticing her quiet intensity. "Something like that," Sarah replied, managing a small smile. She had learned to deflect personal questions with practiced ease. The classroom filled quickly as Professor Chen's reputation preceded him. Known for his brilliant research in trauma psychology and his uncompromising academic standards, he commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Students whispered about his legendary demands for perfection and his intolerance for weakness. David entered precisely at 9 o'clock, his presence immediately commanding attention. He surveyed the room with sharp eyes, making mental notes about each student. When his gaze landed on Sarah, it lingered for a moment before moving on. Something about her stillness intrigued him, though he could not yet identify what. "Welcome to Advanced Trauma Psychology," David began, his voice carrying authority. "This course will challenge everything you think you know about human resilience. We will explore the deepest wounds of the human psyche and examine how people rebuild their lives after devastating loss." Sarah's pen moved steadily across her notebook, capturing every word. The irony of studying trauma while living with its daily reality was not lost on her. She had learned more about psychological recovery in hospital beds than most people would discover in textbooks. "I expect excellence from each of you," David continued. "There will be no accommodations for personal difficulties, no extensions for emotional distress. If you cannot handle the demands of this program, I suggest you reconsider your career choice." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. She had heard similar speeches from drill sergeants and commanding officers. Academic intimidation felt mild compared to what she had already endured. "Your first assignment is due in 2 weeks," David announced, handing out syllabi. "A 15-page analysis of post-traumatic growth patterns in combat veterans. I want rigorous research, not sympathetic speculation." As papers passed down the rows, Sarah accepted her copy without comment. The assignment topic hit closer to home than Professor Chun could possibly know. She wondered if she could write about her own experience without revealing too much, or if maintaining professional distance would prove impossible. The class continued with David outlining his expectations and methodology. His approach was clinical and detached, treating trauma as an academic puzzle to be solved rather than a human experience to be understood. Sarah found his perspective both fascinating and troubling. When class ended, students filed out with mixed expressions of excitement and trepidation. Sarah gathered her materials slowly, allowing others to leave first. Movement in crowds still made her nervous, a lingering effect of heightened situational awareness that never fully faded. Marcus waited for her by the door. "Want to grab coffee and compare notes?" he offered. "That was intense." "Thanks, but I need to get to the library," Sarah replied. She appreciated his kindness, but preferred to work alone when processing difficult material. As Sarah made her way across campus, her leg began to ache more noticeably. The morning's walking combined with sitting in an uncomfortable chair had aggravated old injuries. She found an empty bench and sat down carefully, stretching her leg and massaging the scar tissue beneath her jeans. A group of students passed by, laughing about Professor Chen's stern warnings. One young woman complained loudly about professors who expected too much without understanding real-world pressures. Sarah listened with detached amusement, remembering when academic stress had seemed like the most important challenge in her life. Her phone buzzed with a text from her physical therapist reminding her about tomorrow's appointment. The twice-weekly sessions were non-negotiable, part of her ongoing recovery process. She would need to schedule them carefully around her class obligations. At the library, Sarah claimed a quiet corner table and spread out her research materials. The assignment required understanding trauma from both clinical and personal perspectives. She had access to current literature and academic databases, but her real expertise came from lived experience that she could never cite in a bibliography. Opening her laptop, Sarah began searching for relevant studies on post-traumatic growth in military populations. The research was extensive, but often missed the subtle realities of daily life with invisible injuries. Academic papers described symptoms and recovery patterns, but rarely captured the moment-to-moment decisions that shaped a survivor's journey. Her concentration was broken by approaching footsteps. Professor Chen appeared beside her table, his expression unreadable. Sarah tensed automatically, her body responding to unexpected proximity with learned wariness. "Miss Martinez," David said, noting the extensive research materials spread across her workspace. "I'm impressed by your preparation. Most students don't begin research until the week assignments are due." "I prefer to start early," Sarah replied carefully. "It allows time for thorough analysis." David nodded approvingly, but something in her defensive posture caught his attention. She held herself with unusual alertness, her eyes tracking his movements while maintaining polite attention. It was a hypervigilance he recognized from his research, but had rarely observed so clearly in person. "Your background indicates military service," David observed, glancing at the application materials in his folder. "Infantry specialist, I believe." "Yes, sir," Sarah confirmed, using the automatic respect that military training had ingrained. She immediately regretted the formal response, knowing it revealed more than intended. "Interesting career change," David mused. "What drew you from combat to psychology?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah could provide the sanitized answer she had rehearsed for admissions interviews, or she could hint at deeper truths. She chose caution, as always. "I became interested in how people adapt to challenging circumstances," she said. Military experience provided some insight into human resilience. David sensed there was more to her story, but respected her boundaries. Academic relationships required professional distance, especially with students who might have complex backgrounds. Still, her composed demeanor and obvious intelligence intrigued him. "I look forward to reading your analysis," he said before walking away. "I suspect you'll bring a unique perspective to the material." Left alone, Sarah exhaled slowly and returned to her research. Professor Chin's attention felt both validating and dangerous. She had worked hard to blend into academic environments without drawing notice to her differences. Standing out, even positively, meant increased scrutiny she preferred to avoid. As afternoon faded to evening, Sarah continued working through stacks of academic articles and case studies. Her leg cramped periodically, forcing her to shift positions and stretch carefully. The pain was manageable but constant, a reminder of sacrifices that civilians could never fully comprehend. The library grew quieter as other students departed for dinner and social activities. Sarah preferred these peaceful hours when she could work without distraction or observation. Solitude had become her ally, a space where she could drop the careful mask of normalcy she wore in public. Her research revealed fascinating patterns in trauma recovery, particularly the concept of post-traumatic growth where individuals emerge stronger from devastating experiences. The academic literature described this phenomenon in clinical terms, but Sarah understood it viscerally as a daily choice between despair and determination. One study caught her attention, examining how combat veterans integrated their military identity with civilian roles. The research highlighted the challenge of translating skills and perspectives across radically different environments. Sarah recognized her own struggle in these pages, the ongoing effort to find purpose and meaning in a world that often seemed trivial compared to life and death experiences. As the library prepared to close, Sarah packed her materials and headed back to her apartment. The campus was quiet now, lit by scattered streetlights and the glow from dormitory windows. She walked carefully on the uneven sidewalk, her injured leg more unstable in darkness. Her small apartment reflected her practical nature and limited budget. Military habits persisted in her organized living space, everything clean and purposefully arranged. Photos from her deployment were tucked away in a drawer, too painful for daily viewing but too important to discard. Sarah prepared a simple dinner and reviewed her notes from the day. Professor Chin's assignment would require careful balance between academic objectivity and personal insight. She needed to demonstrate scholarly competence while protecting the private truths that gave her analysis its depth. Before bed, Sarah completed her evening physical therapy routine, working through exercises designed to maintain mobility and manage chronic pain. The movements were familiar and meditative, a bridge between her military past and uncertain future. As she settled into sleep, Sarah thought about tomorrow's classes and the weeks ahead. Graduate school represented a chance to rebuild her life around new purpose and meaning. Professor Chin's course would challenge her in ways he could not imagine, but she was determined to succeed regardless of the personal cost. Her dreams that night mixed memories of desert landscapes with classroom discussions, the two worlds of her experience colliding in ways that both threatened and strengthened her resolve. She had survived worse challenges than academic expectations, even if others could not see the battles she continued to fight every day.